Talk with Andy.
Okay. Andy's book talk. Okay.
It's going to be the actor origin story.
Oh, okay.
That's how we're tying it in.
Okay.
So,
Send me the information so we can make a fly,
yes, right. Because you see how I did this one.
Mm-hmm.
I just had fun.
Yeah, no, I understand. How was it?
It was good. Yeah, it was really good. Yeah, we had a nice
The topic
crowd.
looked good.
Yeah, people learn.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it was very cool. Miss Mary have some tea. That sounds like a nice healing tea, doesn't it? Oh, honey. Thank you. So, yeah, we're also crazy.
So you're just like perpetually in the same,
Yes.
We did the same. Colombia. From 1 to 5 a.m.
in the end, he's supposed to.
All right, I saw you say we're up on
Yeah, I wasn't there.
What did you
It was a road. They can order from the menu. It was the Howard County Muslim Association or something like that. And in the past, they've gone to like IHOP, places like that, and it's kind of like that. So they want something different. So they came in, and I looked at it online.
You can also tell too, that like,
It was,
when presidents are in office,
And did you have special menu? Did you have special menu?
I would say. Well, we had the same menu, but we abbreviated stuff. We had a lot of breakfast things and a couple of restaurant types.
so it's like, yes, and
They
it's
have like
like,
the
I didn't see that. I don't really know what it was. Maybe some prayer or something like that. I'm not sure. But it was about 150 foot.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's impressive.
Yeah, it was impressive. I mean, I don't think it was again because it's right. The straight, but people volunteers got paid double time, so it was like, hey, we'll do it. Yeah, I'm sure they got paid.
Did you ever see
you know, like you're never into your own possibility because like,
well, people were
encouraged.
No, they were.
But certain restaurants
People were encouraged to buy those.
and cash. I saw that too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Just like if you
There's always so much talk about all of our business.
Yeah.
But there's
even
hardly
if your school
ever
is
talk
also
about
if your school isn't a school is like
and that it is the right of so much. Well, you know, they made it very, which
Yes.
there's an interesting.
as long as you're eligible, as long as you're
Always
great,
talk.
and it's also Asian. I think if you like,
And I
can,
just keep
you
thinking,
have to turn eight years of all of your followers.
but it's not only that, it's this
Later,
that he treated him that way. Where is the outrage for greater than this? I just, me too.
I'm a fan of Zelensky. That was something weird.
Yeah, I just, I was sitting down and my
Testing.
humiliation.
Testing.
Oh, yeah.
So I just, I mean,
That was classic
yeah.
humiliation, right?
My new title is
Testing.
like,
It's interesting.
Testing. Testing.
Just because you speak louder doesn't mean.
Just working. Actually, I got a meeting later, like around like 3. That's about it.
Oscars. Yeah. So, hello everyone. I know this is a really light showing. People will be getting detention that didn't show up in class today. Just FYI. You get extra credit today, right? But I really thought this would be a really, really popular conversation. Now, a lot of people may be fasting, and that, of course, makes it really difficult for people to wake up early and come here. But anyway, I wanted to have a conversation. We've had one. How many of you have been to all of them? One. Wow.
Me? This is the fifth one, right?
All right. You missed one. Okay. So we had, this is number 5, right? So we had the first one was on Palestine, second one on Syria, the third one on Russia, the fourth one on Iran. This one is on Islam. Next week we have one on use of AI in warfare.
Nice.
And the one after that is on Zionism. So we have 2 more, and then we're going to take a little bit of a break and then come back again for another session. But hopefully you can attend as many as possible. So this of course is the second day of Ramadan today, and for those of you that are fasting, you can sit in the front if you like. I know that some people may be eating, but anyway, we thought it'd be a great conversation. Oftentimes maligned, oftentimes misunderstood, oftentimes needed, oftentimes, it's one of the best religions in the world. I know that you can work in prisons, incarceration places, and I'd say the majority of the people that are incarcerated that I've encountered have either converted or find Islam to be a very comfortable space to be in, which I find fascinating. I'd be curious to know why that is. So anyway, invite somebody who's an expert in the topic of Islam, political Islam in particular, and Dr. Nader Hashemi is a professor at Georgetown University, and he has been doing lots of programming with us around important topics. He's had some really great people here, and he's interviewed a few of them.
endeavor and project that we all have to participate in is to try and figure out how did we get to this place in terms of the decline and effectively destruction of what was once a democracy, and now we have an authoritarian president, Congress, political system. Understanding how we got here, and then critically, how do we get out of this moment in time? And I think it's going to require a lot of organizing, a lot of education, and I think one of the big problems that many people, I think, don't appreciate is how, in many ways, the Democratic Party, particularly the ruling elites of the Democratic Party, are a big part of the problem that we're facing. And so I'm hoping that this location can be sort of a place where we can gather to figure out where do we go next to try and save what's left of the United States and bring about the type of, I think, just society that we all aspire to. So that's my preamble for my talk. So Andy invited me to give a talk on Islam, and I thought I would just, rather than prepare a separate presentation, draw upon something that I've already done before. I do actually have a separate presentation on political Islam itself, which I'm happy to give at another time. This is a presentation that's predicated on a project that I finished a couple of years ago, this 4-volume study on Islam and human rights. And I was asked by the editors of this, of Routledge Press, to put together one of these reference works. So I spent 5 years reading the entire academic and scholarly literature on Islam and human rights, and I collected what I consider to be the most important writings in 4 volumes. I encourage you not to buy this book, which is weird for an author to say, because it's one of those reference works that only a library can afford to purchase. These 4 volumes cost, I think, about $1,300. So it's not for the average citizen, but at the introduction, the first volume, I had to write an 8,000-word introductory essay in this topic. That's what I'm going to draw upon. So what I'm going to present this morning is, there is an almost verbatim transcript with references and sources that you can obtain if you go to my website and you read the article, or you can email me and I can send it to you. So I want to give a 50-year retrospective on sort of the debate on Islam and human rights. It's really more accurately, the topic is really about Islam, Muslim majority societies, and human rights, but in a global perspective. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and I look forward to your questions and answers. But the topic that you raised, and is actually really important, why so many people were incarcerated in prison, contrary to what many people might think, are converting to Islam. Given the reputation that Islam has in the mainstream, why is it so popular in prisons? Why is it still the fastest growing religion in the world? There's a disconnect there that needs an explanation, and it's not difficult to answer that question because when we look at modern American history, some of our most prominent intellectuals and activists have been converts to Islam. The most prominent being Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and many others. So I'm happy to answer that question. But I want to focus really on the big global debate on Islam and human rights. What can we learn from it? Where do things stand? What are the points of tension and friction and controversy that frequently come up in this discussion? And then I'm looking forward to the Q&A session where I can answer your questions. So when future intellectual historians look back on the late 20th and 21st centuries, the debate on Islam and human rights will feature quite prominently in their historic writings on this period of time. And the reasons for this are not difficult to fathom. The debate on Islam and human rights overlaps with some of the most controversial and emotionally charged debates that you're all familiar with. A short list of these events in the late 20th and 21st century that either were directly related to the question of Islam and human rights or indirectly related to the question of Islam and human rights are the following. 1979 Iranian Revolution. The mainstreaming of political Islam in the Middle East as an opposition current challenging existing ruling regimes. The ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. The Salman Rushdie affair. Turkey's quest to get into the European Union. The rise, fall, and now return of the Taliban. The Danish cartoon controversy. The hijab controversy in France, where in 1989, some hijab-wearing young girls wanted to go to school wearing the hijab, and that set off a huge debate in France that hasn't really died away, producing debates both in France and in the province of Quebec over the question of what constitutes secularism, the question of multiculturalism, the question of immigration, more in Europe, less here, and debates on pluralism and what constitutes reasonable accommodation for minority groups. Also of critical importance in terms of global events that have impacted the debate on Islamic human rights is the Al-Qaeda terror attacks on 9/11 and the subsequent American, British, and Western occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. The later emergence of ISIS as a phenomenon, and finally, the global rise of authoritarianism, a right-wing ideology where anti-Muslim sentiment and bigotry is a key component of right-wing, authoritarian fascist politics today. In all of these cases, the question of Islam, Muslims, and human rights have been front and center in the public, intellectual, and the policy debate. Now, the relationship between Islam and human rights is interesting for several additional reasons, and I already hinted at that when I was talking about the whole question of conversion to Islam in American prisons. According to the Pew Research Center, 25% of our planet today, approximately 25% of our planet today is made up of Muslims, so roughly 1/4. By 2050, almost 1/3 of the planet will be made up of Muslims. Islam is the second largest religion in the world, and it produces, as I just mentioned a moment ago, the largest numbers of converts. 49 countries have a Muslim majority population, and of course we have significant Muslim minority populations that exist in India, China, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, where their status is subject to debate, disagreement, discrimination, and in several cases we have genocides facing minority populations. The Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, Gaza today, of course, and the situation in Sudan. So how to make sense of all of this? Let me begin by talking about some historical sort of points of reference that are foundational to understanding this topic. In the West, the question of Islam and human rights are often discussed as a form of binary opposites with little in common. You have human rights, you understand what they mean, there's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then we have Islam, which allegedly represents the opposite, the antithesis. These two things, they can't overlap. I mean, there's actually an interesting story here that I'm reminded about. Right after 9/11, I made my first trip to the United States from Canada, where I was living. Things were very tense at the border when I was crossing. And I remember the passport office was asking me, what do you want to the United States for? And I said, well, I'm a PhD student. And he goes, well, what are you studying? I said, I'm studying the relationship between Islam and democracy. And he just broke up laughing. You're not serious, are you? No, I said, I am serious. Well, that's not going to be a really short presentation, you're right. So this is the mainstream view, right? With scant attention, very little attention, however, is ever given to the lived historical reality, specifically in the 20th century, where Muslim men and women engaged with the ideas of human rights and democracy and tried to realize those ideals in their own societies. It can be said that these new intellectual engagements within Muslim societies, among intellectuals, occurred initially during the age of European empires, and in the context of colonialism and imperialism and later struggles for decolonization, where the main much of the Muslim majority world from, I would say, right into the early 20th century until the end of the 20th century, the main theme was the struggle for political independence for Europe. That's actually one reason why I think the question of Gaza resonates so powerfully and emotionally, not just in the Arab Muslim world, but across the third world, is because it's the independent colonization, which is a foundational sort of organizing theme of the 20th century for many people around the world. When we see what's happening in Gaza today, it's sort of Vietnam flashback. People can instinctively realize. So the age of European empires brought profound social, political, and economic changes to most majority societies. The old political, social, economic order, the traditional hierarchies that existed there were slowly displaced, and new ideas, new political formations and movements emerged. It was during this era that Muslim political and religious movements emerged, which were later to be called political Islamists, which was a broad category of many different faces. These organizations, these movements, largely known as political Islamists, were reactionary or reactive, and they were primarily concerned with expelling colonizers and imperialists. And they introduced ideas into Muslim societies made the situation of human rights much more difficult. To complicate matters further, that 20% intellectual thought revolved around these types of questions, but they were never separate from the legacy of imperialism, the ongoing engagement and intervention of Western powers into the Middle East and that's the broad context for these early installations. Liberal Islam believed that the West's strengths, the reason why the West was able to accomplish and how powerful needed to be at some level understood and perhaps indigenized in Muslim societies. Not replicated, but at least trying to figure out why was the West so powerful, prominent, successful, and why were we not as successful? So the questions that sort of emerge with respect to human rights for Muslims, not just the question of gender equality, the question of human rights more broadly, the importance of constitutionalism, and broader theme of democracy. These are also ideas that Muslim leaders engaged with in society, it's important to point out when we talk about these political Islamist groups, now they're quite prominent and powerful, but they were marginal parts of the politics of Muslim societies until the end of the 20th century. And that's not difficult to figure out. The dominant sort of intellectual ideas and sort of debates that were foundational to this question of political independence. Nationalism inherently is broadly a secular idea, but of course it can be infused with religious ideas. That was the dominant sort of thing. So you do have, in the 20th century, the gradual emergence of what I call religious politics, religious-based movements, but they're not mainstream. They're marginal, and they grow in popularity as we get to the end of the 20th century for reasons that we can talk about during the question and answer session. Both religious-based groups, Islamist groups, and liberal Islamic thinkers, in many ways, are the flip side of the same coin. They were both shaped; their ideas were shaped by the 20th century engagement with the West and with the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. Political Islamists, ironically, borrowed quite liberally from very illiberal Western traditions. So if you take the case of this very prominent and influential political Islamist thinker, the Pakistani intellectual and Islamist theologian, Maulana Maududi, he wrote extensively about Islam and human rights. And he argued in one of his books that, quote, I want to rid the westernized Muslim intellectuals of the wrong notion that they need to borrow from others in matters of culture and civilization. And he defined the theme of jihad as sort of a revolutionary Islamic ideology and program that seeks to alter the social order, to bring about revolutionary change, and to rebuild a new society on indigenous religious ideals and tenets. If you read the political agenda of many of the leading Islamic or Islamist theoreticians, Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, Khomeini, many of them actually sound very similar to revolutionary Marxists or Leninists in terms of their desire to tear down the old social political order, build a new one in its place based on a broad program of social justice. But of course, the difference here is that political Islamists want to found this new program of social and political justice on a particular interpretation of Islam. And one of the things that, when I started studying this topic, I was actually quite intrigued when I went to Egypt in the late 1980s, and I was talking to people, and I was introduced to various thinkers, and they were frequently introduced to me as a leading Islamist intellectual who's formerly a Marxist. Many of these people who were Marxists in an earlier age become Islamist intellectuals, I think, for reasons that I'm mentioning right now. The underlying political program and project is one rooted in social, economic, political justice, and anti-imperialism. The language and the vocabulary is different, and then of course there are deep tensions in terms of sort of the political program and the idea of citizenship rights and state society relations. But that's sort of a common theme that emerges. And so when you read someone like Maulana Maududi or Sayyid Qutb, you can clearly see that they're borrowing from a European revolutionary vocabulary that echoes Marx and Lenin. In a very real sense, Islam is redefined by these political Islamists. New meanings are poured into familiar words. And you sort of see this sort of political program that's really at the foundation of this project. Of course, when political Islamists or any group comes to power and they control a state with the apparatus that you can wield this power without any checks and balances, then you get into the types of problems of political repression and authoritarianism that you're all familiar with. And I'll say something about this a little bit later in my presentation. So political Islamists define much of the contemporary Muslim world as being fundamentally un-Islamic. And there's a tension there because it really didn't make sense in just the obvious reading. You're living in a Muslim majority society where most people are Muslim and most people are practicing Islam, but you feel that there's insufficient Islamic representation and manifestation in your own society. And what they really meant was they wanted, these political Islamists, they wanted a politicized understanding of religion that could seize the state and that could transform their own societies and also challenge the international political and economic order. That's what they meant when they said that there was insufficient Islam in society. They were really saying is we don't like this traditional, apolitical, superstitious form of Islam where people just focus on the rituals. We want a politicized, organized, in many ways revolutionary form of Islam that can transform our own societies and the world. And we use religion to do it. That was very much the project. And so you have these debates that emerge in Muslim societies as a result of the rise of political Islam over what constitutes Islamic authenticity. What does it mean to be a real Muslim in the 20th century, living in the world that we inhabit? Does it just mean practice the rituals, and that's fine, and it's story? Or does it mean that no, the rituals are important, but you have to engage with the problems of social, political, and economic injustice, authoritarianism, political tyranny, imperialism, and you have to try and seize the world. So in many ways, if you study the political Islamist project, and you study revolutionary social movements, you'll see a lot of overlap. but there's also important differences. In the Western scholarship on Islam and human rights, up until now, the Western scholarship on Islam and human rights has narrowly focused on how these political Islamist movements, simply are effectively terrorist organizations that stand for no good, and they just have to be eradicated. And the more that we can get more compliant forms of religious leaders, like we see in sort of many of these dictators in the Arab world, then that would be a wonderful arrangement for the West and for its relationship with the rest of the world. So this is sort of one of the problems that we sort of have in the early debate on Islam and human rights. It's difficult to locate, actually, when I was trying to figure out when did this topic of Islam and human rights become a problem? When did people actually start to write about it as sort of an issue that needed some attention? When you look at the academic literature on the topic, the debate on Islam and human rights is difficult to locate. It's not until the late 1970s that the subject actually begins to come up. In the early years of the United Nations, there was actually very little controversy. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was debated and adopted in 1948, along with its two subsequent covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1966, Muslim states participated in these debates, and overwhelmingly they were supportive of these documents. Muslims participated and played an important role in drafting and discussing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They discussed the primacy of individual rights versus the authority of the state. Muslim delegates at these meetings discussed the question of women's rights more broadly, specifically women's rights in marriage, and the question of religious freedom. Not only did Muslim representatives play an important role in moving these human rights documents forward and universalizing them, they actually, in many ways, were leading figures who actually championed some of these provisions at the UN. One particular scholar notes that the foreign minister of Pakistan, who headed his delegation in 1948, made important contributions in terms of insisting that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights really focus on the theme of freedom of religion. Also, you have delegates from Iraq, from Syria, from Afghanistan, who served as sort of heads of the different sort of subcommittees that sort of advanced this particular document and made it sort of a standard reference point. When we think about what is human rights, we think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's often forgotten that actually Muslims played an important role at these debates. There's one particular figure that we discovered when we were sort of investigating this topic, and this is this fascinating person who's generally unknown in the debate on human rights, both generally in the West and within her home country of Pakistan. Shaista Ikramullah was a member of the Third Committee, a Pakistani delegate with Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was the only woman and sole Muslim to have worked on drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She took a strong interest in the formulation of Article 16, which explicitly championed equal rights for women and men in marriage. Ambassador Ikramullah later said, "It was imperative that the peoples of the world should recognize the existence of a code of civilized behavior which would apply not only in international relations, but also in domestic affairs." A pioneering female human rights thinker in an era of global male chauvinism, she later became a member of the Committee on the Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And she later noted in some of her writings her deep sorrow that many states did not really want to have a more expansive understanding of the concept of genocide to include the term and the concept of cultural genocide in the founding document. And the countries that opposed it were the great powers, both the USSR at the time and the United States. Ikramullah later observed that there were Western nations that believed that the draft declaration on human rights actually went too far, and they wanted to roll those things back. South Africa, under apartheid, fell into this category, and many Western nations, she says, in the Anglo-American world, believed that the focus should be on individual rights exclusively, and not the responsibility that states had with respect to their own citizens. So you had ideological divisions that were starting to emerge at this time between the Soviet Union and Western nations on the question of human rights. But few scholars who study human rights are actually familiar with her work and the contributions that she made at these founding moments of the debates on human rights. The other sort of interesting moment was in 1972, when you have this document called, actually before that, you have this document that is produced in 1972. I don't have a slide, which is still around today, called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And this is an organization where all Muslim states belong to. And what's interesting is if you look at the founding document of this organization that emerged in 1972, the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is actually a founding sort of reference point in this document in 1972 that all Muslim states are members. This OIC Charter, as it's called, was ratified in 1974, but in 1990, you have an important change that takes place. So this is near the end of the 20th century. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation announces that, wait a second, our old document is no longer relevant. We have come up with this new thing called the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights. And this document differs significantly from international human rights norms. Article 22A, for example, states that everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression and to exercise his or her opinion in a manner that is suited by them, provided and on the condition that it doesn't violate the core principles of Sharia, Islamic law. The content of Sharia or Islamic law and who had authority to interpret it was deliberately left clear. But this is an important shift that we see in Muslim societies over the question of human rights. And it can be explained by two factors. So in other words, what's happening here is we get to the end of the 20th century, Muslim societies, Muslim states start to say, wait a second, yes, we support human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, etc., but on the condition that it doesn't violate Islamic norms. What are these Islamic norms? Who interprets them? Left vague. But that allowed for a broad sort of interpretation, which basically meant whoever had political power would sort of make that determination. And then that produced a lot of human rights problems along the way. So how do we explain this shift? Why did all of a sudden, as we get to the end of the 20th century, the Muslim states and many sort of, civil society movements start to sort of qualify their commitment to human rights by saying that, yes, human rights, but as long as it doesn't violate the principles of Islamic law. I think there's two factors that explain this shift. One at the level of the state, where Muslim ruling elites, seeking to perpetuate their authoritarian rule, sought to manipulate and instrumentalize religion in the service of political power. And then at the level of society, you had these religious-based Islamist organizations who were using identity politics, also seeking political power, demanding a rewriting of laws to conform with their new understanding of politicized Islam. So you have this sort of, political shift that takes place at the level of state level of society, where you have these currents of thought that were saying, no, we want a new understanding of human rights that incorporates these qualifications to human rights understanding. One of the great scholars, if you want to read anything on Islam and human rights, and my views on this are deeply shaped by the man who's on the screen right now. Professor Khalid Abdul Fadl, who's a professor of law at UCLA, has written perhaps the most sophisticated, intellectually rich writings on the relationship and tensions between Islam and human rights. He's actually a unique figure in the sense that he's a classically trained Islamic jurist, where he has the moral authority to issue religious decrees, but he's also a product of the U.S. Ivy League school system. And now he teaches at UCLA. So he has this sort of both worlds. He was on the board of directors of human rights. And he sort of, in writing about sort of the crisis of Islam and human rights, has noted that there's been a particular corruption of Islam's ethical orientation and its heritage and its potential to advance human rights concepts and theories. According to Professor Abdul Fadl, who's a leading scholar of Islam and human rights. Islamic thinking, at least at this moment, has remained reactive, he says, in that it defines its position vis-a-vis democracy or human rights, always in relationship to how the other defines himself. And the other in this case is the hegemonic West. In developing this idea further, Abu Fadl observes that in the age of post-colonialism, Muslims have been preoccupied with attempts to remedy a collective feeling of powerlessness and a frustrating sense of political defeat, often by engaging in sensationalist acts of power symbolism. The normative imperatives and intellectual subtleties of the Islamic moral tradition have not been treated with the type of analytical and critical rigor that they rightly deserve, but are often rendered subservient to political expedience and symbolic displays of power. So what's he saying here? He's basically saying that because of this feeling of humiliation, of disenfranchisement, of the legacy of colonialism and post-colonialism, where Muslims are still living under authoritarian regimes. They don't have a voice. They don't have any hope that their future will get better. They often interpret their religious heritage as a form of power symbolism, as a way of sort of lashing out and responding to this feeling of humiliation and powerlessness. They don't treat their religious heritage with the type of, what he says, analytical rigor that can actually be interpreted in ways that could advance a human rights discourse and human rights concepts. There is this collective feeling where there's a very superficial level of engagement with and advocacy from Muslim political parties and groups that don't sort of get at the deeper sort of historical contributions that Islam and Muslim thinkers have made to questions such as minority rights, social justice, economic rights, etc. So this is a big problem. I encourage you to read his writings. They're probably the most eloquent that you can find. If you want some references, feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to give them to you. So the late 1970s was a major turning point, as I said, in this whole debate on Islam and human rights. It's noteworthy that the serious interest in the West on the question of Islam and human rights arises after Western economic and political interests in the Middle East began to be threatened. And the big challenge was the 1979 revolution, when, if you know the story, it was a shocking development. The Shah of Iran was the West's favorite sort of dictator in the region. He was widely viewed as sort of a popular president, a popular leader. There's a very famous story that I love to tell my students, which sort of captures this point and captures how disconnected Western leaders and analysts and scholars were with respect to their understanding of the Muslim world. So there's this very famous event at the end of the 1970s, 1977, 78. Jimmy Carter, then president, travels to Iran, and he's received as a guest of honor. There's this big state dinner, and on national television, Jimmy Carter lifts up his glass of champagne and says, "I want to sort of make a toast to the Shah of Iran," who he says is a wonderful leader, deeply admired by his own people, deeply loved by his own citizens, presiding over a part of the world that's deeply unstable and uncertain, but at least in Iran there's tranquility and stability. I'm paraphrasing. That's basically what Jimmy Carter says. And then a few months later, the Iranian Revolution breaks out. And everyone is scratching their heads. How the hell did that happen? And a revolutionary regime comes to power that challenges Western interests. And this is when we begin to see a big concern about Islam and human rights. Edward Said has wrote a really good book around this time, which has been updated, called Covering Islam, that very much looks at the discourse and the debates and the media's sort of fascination, but also denigration and discrimination that this moment in time produced for a broadly Western audience. In other words, the revolution in Iran was interpreted by in the mainstream as just this religion that just went berserk. Why are these people in the name of Islam seizing the state and then, God forbid, even seizing the American embassy there's no rational explanation to this. Completely ignored at this moment was the role of the West in Iran's modern history, the role of the United States in initiating a CIA coup in 1953 to topple democracy and overthrew popular democratic. And then completely ignored was the role of the United States in backing a brutal dictator for 25 years. It was just all of a sudden there's something about this particular expression of this. It was all about Islam. Islam was sort of obviously incompatible with modernity and human rights, and proof positive. You have sort of what's going on in Iran. So there's no sense of the backstory that produced this type of revolutionary fervor. And that's when you sort of began to see this debate on Islam and human rights getting a lot of mainstream sort of coverage and debate in the West. What was interesting was, of course, that more authoritarian interpretations of Islam that were compatible with Western interests was never a problem. I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, and then the Taliban in the early days, or at least the Afghan Majority. Those types of Islam were perfectly fine, even though their normative projections and manifestation were deeply antithetical to human rights. It's only the types of Islam that are radical, that are revolutionary, and that challenge Western interests that they became a part of. And so that's sort of the background to the early Western fascination on Islam and human rights. The 1979 Iranian Revolution begins this new trend in Muslim politics, where religiously inspired protest movements, asserting themselves in a bid to obtain political power, seek to obtain political power and transform not only their own societies, but the region in which they live in, and if possible, the entire world. The post-colonial secular state had begun to fail at this moment, and these political Islamist organizations and movements argued that they wanted to promote a new understanding of Islam that would change the social, political, economic orientation. And you begin to see this phenomenon in the Arab world. You begin to see it in Pakistan, you begin to see it in Malaysia, you begin to see it in Indonesia, where this new wave of politicized Islam, promoted by new debates on Islamic authenticity and identity politics, starts to dominate the politics of the Islamic world. And this is a major journey. But also you start to have big problems when these political groups start to either obtain power or start to have influence over power in terms of human rights. So one of the things that happens in Pakistan is you don't have a revolution there, but you have basically a military regime that knows it's vulnerable, and it hopes to preserve its political power by saying, look, we understand, we've heard the voices, we're going to start to promote these new allegedly Islamic authentic understandings of the law. And so they promote this thing called the Hudud Ordinances, which are these new laws that start to impose harsh penalties for theft, the consumption of alcohol, extramarital sex, blasphemy, and apostasy. These are new laws that all of a sudden, in the late 1970s, in the 80s and 90s, start to become enforced. Happens in Malaysia, happens in other parts of the Islamic world. And political leaders do this to say that, look, we are trying to, live up to what it means to be an authentic Muslim. And so they spin this narrative, and for reasons that we can get into, it does have a certain appeal in some parts of the Islamic world. So as we get to the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, we have another critical moment and turning point in terms of the debate on Islamic human rights. There are a good many people who thought at this moment, one observer wrote, that with the end of the war between communism and the West, it will now be replaced with a new war in the post-Cold War era between the West and Muslims. There was a flurry of articles, which then became books that appeared that echoed this particular sentiment. From Francis Fukuyama's thesis on the end of history, to Bernard Lewis's essay on the roots of Muslim rage, to Robert Kaplan's suggestion that the post-Cold world will be defined by a coming anarchy, and then most influentially by Harvard political scientists' essay and then later book, The Clash of Civilizations. All of these influential debates and books, collectively, that were read and debated and taught in courses, reinforced an idea that the Islamic faith writ large, and Muslim civilization as well were fundamentally and enduringly incompatible with liberty, democracy, human rights, gender equality, and other emancipatory principles. As early as 1991, Francis Fukuyama suggested that after the Cold War, the world will henceforth be divided along different lines, he wrote, where the Third World and the Islamic world will define the main axis of conflict. And Samuel Huntington was even more explicit, where he said in his book on the Clash of Civilizations that, quote, the underlying problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism, it is Islam, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the superiority of their culture and are obsessed with the inferiority of their power, end quote. And then we have the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which appeared to confirm this grim prognosis by many of these writers. For many people, and many Western intellectuals, Samuel Huntington's thesis on the clash of civilizations seemed to be vindicated by the actions of Osama bin Laden. While Princeton historian Bernard Lewis wrote that Al-Qaeda does not really differ from the mainstream of Muslims on questions of theology and the interpretation of Scripture. They're basically one and the same. In other words, what you saw and see in bin Laden, that's basically Islam. With this type of narrative and this type of critique of Islam, the floodgates were wide open. And an interest in all things related to Islam and Muslims, particularly questions of human rights and democracy, developed at a dizzying rate. Largely forgotten, of course, in this debate after 9/11, was the fact that on September the 11th, Islam did not attack the United States. Al-Qaeda did. But the equation of those two things speaks to the problem of Islamophobia. In other words, those attackers, those 19 hijackers, really embodied what Islam stands for. That was the deal. Ignoring the fact that 15 out of the 19 hijackers came from one country, Saudi Arabia, which speaks to a particular internal problem in Saudi Arabia that no one at the time, back then or now, wanted to engage with. So this particular moment after 9/11 led to a huge frenzy and almost, it became actually very difficult. I was sort of doing my PhD at this time. It became very difficult to actually even have serious conversations because after 3,000 Americans were killed on that day, it was just a frenzied atmosphere where there was a lot of interest in the subject, but there was also a lot of emotion attached to it, which hindered an objective understanding. So that became a big problem, and of course, then it quickly led to the American and British and Western interventions in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And then the next big sort of event that happened with respect to this topic is the whole question of the rise of ISIS. There was a very famous essay that appeared in this magazine, The Atlantic, by this journalist called Graham Wood, where he basically made the argument. And he quoted from this one particular scholar at Princeton University, Bernard Haykel, who said that, look, again, what we're seeing here with this ISIS mayhem, destruction, mutilation, destruction, is really just a manifestation of what Islam is all about. Look at what they're saying and look at what they're doing. There's not much difference between what Islam has done in the past and what's happening today. All we need to know is it's a bad thing. We got to oppose it as best we could. This is the type of stuff that was very much within the mainstream of debate. And it sort of made it very difficult to sort of have a serious conversation. So while media bias and Orientalism or Islamophobia was a big problem at this time, I think it would be sort of insufficient and irresponsible of me to sort of leave the problem at this point. There are serious and substantive problems that exist within Muslim societies and within Muslim organizations, and in the minds of some Muslim leaders, both religious and political, with respect to the question of human rights that have to be addressed. I think the first point that one needs to make in trying to understand this topic of Islamic human rights at a deeper level is that, Muslims or Islam are not monolithic. There often is this assumption, and it's an assumption that's actually unique to Islam, that somehow all Muslims think and behave the same. There's no nuance, there's no difference, there's no transformation, there's no adaptation, it's just one size fits all. And we never adopt that type of monolithic thinking to other religious traditions or civilizations. There's an inherent understanding that, look, Christianity as a major religious tradition has a lot of different nuances, schools of thought, has transformed and adapted itself over the years, and we understand the socioeconomic political conditions that produce different manifestations of religion. No one really challenges that notion. No one challenges that notion in the case of other religious traditions, Judaism or Hinduism. But there's still this lingering sort of problem that, there is this monolithic Islam. It sort of doesn't have any internal divisions, and it's basically one bad thing. And all you need to know is sort of to understand that thing and try and reject it. This is a big problem when one comes to think about this topic, and it's something that has to be jettisoned or avoided if you want to make any progress in understanding the tensions and the challenges with this topic. So there are a range of views that exist in Muslim societies on the question of Islamic human rights, from liberal perspectives to conservative perspectives to many shades in between. Firm positions have been adopted by influential Muslim organizations, by Islamic scholars and political leaders that have produced an ethical chasm between their political positions as Muslim organizations and leaders and what we call today international human rights standards. In short, an interpretation of Islam that's often premised on a literalist reading of the text, in this case the Quran, and a conservative application of Islamic law has produced deeply problematic conditions with respect to human rights, both normatively and practically in many Muslim societies. The key points of tension that come up, if you look at this debate closely, on the question of Islam and human rights, is the theme of the legal equality of women under the law. This used to be a big debate. I think it's changed quite significantly over the years, but historically it was a big problem. Second point, the idea of equal citizenship under the law for non-Muslims. Traditionally, in Islamic law, and if you look at, for example, the Ottoman Empire as one example, traditionally, the normative sort of position was that minority religions had status, had protection, had rights, but never full equal rights. In a Muslim empire or political domain, there was a clear division in traditional Islamic law between Muslims and non-Muslims. And so when contemporary Muslims in the 20th century tried to sort of evaluate and come up with new political projects, they imported that whole historic understanding that was developed in the pre-modern era, before the idea of human rights was even on the radar screen of anyone. And they said, well, that's how it was in the past. That's what it's got to be in the contemporary moment. And so that issue itself, the question and the status, the legal status of non-Muslims in a Muslim majority society became a focal point for tension, debate, and discussion. The other big theme is the question of freedom of religion and the question of apostasy. Freedom of speech versus attempts to limit free speech in the name of blasphemy. These questions of, can someone rightly and freely abandon their religion and say so in the public domain? And then more importantly, or equally as important, is this theme of blasphemy. Did such a speech constitute such an egregious act of offense to the religious identity of the majority of people in society that that person should then be punished? Should be disciplined, should be put in jail for that type of offense. Now, before I say anything more, this idea of blasphemy and laws against blasphemy existed and has existed in the West until relatively recently. It's not difficult to figure out why you have these blasphemy laws, where the identity of a particular community is so tied up with a particular conception of, in this case, religion, that people hold that sort of identity so sacred that they're not willing to tolerate criticism or mocking of it. This idea of mocking religion, of mocking the sacred, is a relatively new development in the history of humanity. And actually, it exists today in a secular form in many European societies. where if you mock what's considered to be a sacred historic reference point, you can go to jail in the name of social justice and in the name of sort of, in the name of human rights. And what I'm referring to now is sort of the secular equivalent of what I call blasphemy laws that do exist in many European states, is the question of mocking, questioning, or ridiculing the Nazi Holocaust. If you do that in many European societies, it's a punishable offense. You can go to jail. And one can sort of understand why that's the case because of the horrors of the Holocaust. And so the point here is that all societies have a certain concept of what they consider to be sacred. And they're willing to establish laws to limit freedom of speech. And so if you follow this particular theme forward, one of the big issues that frequently comes up in debates at the United Nations, and at moments, those rare moments when Muslims are allowed to gather together to write a new constitution, this question of blasphemy, freedom of speech, what are the limits, what should be the limits, frequently comes up. One of the great experiments, unfortunately it's now part of the past, but I think one of the great experiments on Islamic human rights and constitutionalism and democracy that we witnessed in a relatively recent period of time was in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, when in Tunisia there was a very sophisticated attempt to write a new constitution. And it was a very actually democratic, inclusive constitution that incorporated basically everyone in Tunisia, both secular, religious, people in the middle. And when it came to writing those provisions of the constitution that had to do with blasphemy and freedom of speech, that where things became very tense and contentious. How do we resolve these things? How do we so these are points of friction that emerge in the debate. Debate on these issues, it's important to point out, are not static. They're evolving. Over the past 50 years, there have been considerable transformation, evolution, and adaptation, and reinterpretation of Islamic norms. This is, I think, the other thing that is often part of the misunderstanding about Islam, human rights, and Muslim societies. There is this view that these societies are static. They're frozen in the medieval time. In fact, there's a lot of scholarship by prominent experts who say that if you want to understand what's going on in the Muslim world today, you've got to go back to the medieval period and understand these technical, scriptural debates. And if you can unlock that key, then you can understand what's going on today. It's sort of a deeply reductive and unsophisticated, and actually intellectually sort of embarrassing way of thinking about societies. But this is one of the themes or tropes that comes up with respect to the question of Islam and human rights. There are, and if you look at the volume that I put together, the foregrounds, there are now, and there has been in the last, I would say, 20, 30 years, a proliferation of new ethical readings of Islam's tradition that have started to slowly and surely sink deep roots within Muslim societies. There have been significant shifts that have taken place, particularly and especially on the question of women's equality, largely due to the work of Islamic reformers and women's rights activists. And I'll say something about women's rights activists in a moment. I think it's also important to point out the broader political context where these debates on human rights are taking place today. The dire socioeconomic and political conditions that afflict Muslim-majority societies cannot and should not be ignored. The context that fundamentally shapes the moral contours of the debate on Islamic human rights and that inform ideas and attitudes within Muslim societies are really shaped by what I would call the problem of expanding authoritarianism and growing socioeconomic inequality. One could argue today, and I have argued in my writings, that these are the dark days of Muslim history, replete with torture states, corrupt ruling elites, repressed civil societies, detention centers overflowing with political detainees. Authoritarian regimes are ascendant everywhere, while democratic opposition groups and social protest movements are severely repressed, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. When judged by the key indicators such as democratic development, in other words, what constitutes civil and political rights, press freedom, censorship, women's representation, the status of minorities, and state-sanctioned executions, countries of the Islamic world, the Arab world in particular, have some of the lowest scores in the world. Added to this grim picture is the expansion of mass poverty and economic destitution for hundreds of millions of Muslims. The data on global inequality reveals that the Middle East, despite its abundance of wealth, has some of the highest wealth inequality scores in the world. The World Inequality Lab reports that the Middle East is the world's most unequal region, where 10% of the top captures 61% of the national income. Oxfam has confirmed this finding recently while observing that the coronavirus pandemic has made these socioeconomic and political realities much worse in the Arab and Islamic world. When you look at some of the data on political conflict, indices like the Global Peace Index, like the annual reports that the International Crisis Group puts out, you'll see that in their annual reports, they list the top 10 conflict zones to watch, and often more than half of those conflict zones overlap with areas where Muslims are living as majority populations. If you look at the data on refugees around the world, disproportionately, Muslims constitute a clear majority of the global refugee crisis. The top 7 countries of origin that account for the most refugees in the world involve Muslim populations. This is the economic and social political backdrop that informs the debate on Islamic human rights today. The playing field is far from level. The greatest violators, I think it's important to point out, this is not often appreciated, the biggest violators of human rights in Muslim majority societies today are states, are political regimes, not populations or non-governmental actors. And this is equally, if you just look at what's happened since the Arab Spring, the generally accepted figure in Syria is that 500,000 people lost their lives after the Arab Spring, mostly as a result of the policies of the regime in Damascus. State violators of human rights can be found throughout the Islamic world, with few exceptions. And the reason why state violators are the biggest violators of human rights is because they have capacity. They have an army. They have weapons. They have external allies that supply them with these weapons. Non-state actors can't compete in their capacity when it comes to these types of human rights violations. Consider the 10 most populous states in the Middle East today: Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Syria, Jordan, the UAE, and Israel. In all of these cases, with the possible exception of Iraq, it is the state that is responsible for the vast majority of human rights violations. In the past decade alone, several cases stand out. Just to cite one that's not generally well known, but should be. In 2013, as a result of the US-backed military coup in Egypt, more than 1,000 peaceful protesters were gunned down by the Egyptian regime in what's known as the Rabat massacre in downtown Cairo. Human Rights Watch described that event as a likely crime against humanity in what may have been the worst single day of the killing of protesters in modern history. And I remember at the time, Obama was in power, and the Secretary of State was John Kerry, and he famously described what was happening in Egypt as a result of this coup that included that massacre as a, quote, restoration of democracy in Egypt, when all the evidence was pointing in the opposite direction. You have in Iran a major social protest movement that has been demanding political and socioeconomic change. In 2019, you had an uprising. In 2022, you had a very famous uprising known as the Women Like Freedom movement. And then you had a lot of state repression. And one of the things about Iran that is quite horrifying is that Iran is sort of number 2 in the world in terms of state-sanctioned executions. 1,000 people were executed by the regime last year in Iran, largely, I think, as a result of attempt to send a message to society. If you step out of line, the consequences are horrific. In this, number 1 is China, by a far margin. And a lot of the, of course, executions are not reported. Saudi Arabia is number 3. Egypt comes in next, and then Iraq. So this gives you a sense of sort of some of the problems that we're we're talking about. In the case of Saudi Arabia, which is an American ally, the notorious Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who I like to refer to whenever I get the chance, is the talented Mr. Bonesaw for what he did to the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, is providing over a human rights catastrophe. But he gets a lot of great free press because he's a great business partner for the West. And he goes through the motions of saying, well, now, Nicki Minaj and Justin Bieber, you can go and have a concert there, and so everything is fine and dandy. But if you speak to what's happening in civil society, if you speak to Saudi dissidents, if you find out what's happening at the human rights level, it's a catastrophe. That's Saudi Arabia. Just look at the human rights condition and the level of executions that have taken place under the leadership of the notorious Crown Prince. And then, of course, in terms of the overall human rights condition in the region, that is both a human rights catastrophe now, but has deep destabilizing effects across the Middle East. So, of course, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and now the genocide in Gaza. Things were horrific in Gaza and in the West Bank before October 7th, 2023. Now they're at the level of genocide. What distinguishes, I think, the genocide in Gaza now is that it's distinguished by virtue of the fact that it's a genocide that has been happening in plain sight of all of us, televised, and critically supported by most Western governments. I mean, I was just thinking the other night, how many opposition leaders in any Western government has actually taken a stand in support and solidarity of the human rights of the Palestinians? It's almost unilateral establishment support, both the governments and the opposition parties, with a few exceptions. And even the mainstream media and much of the intellectual establishment. And so this genocide in Gaza, which is going on now for at least 16 months, there's a temporary pause, but all indications are it's going to pick up again. And then now you have the figure of Donald Trump, who comes and says, well, I have a solution to the problem. We're just going to mass expel the citizens of Gaza, and we're going to build a sort of a Riviera in the Middle East. And while that did generate a lot of opposition around the world, if you read the mainstream press coverage, it's quite shocking that the framing of what Trump was proposing was very much downplayed. Oh, it's sort of like it's not pragmatic, it's sort of like kind of daring, but not the type of moral outrage that you would expect. So the situation of human rights in the Middle East has gotten much worse as a result of genocide in Gaza, and it's having destabilizing effects that are going to, I think, produce themselves down the road. One of the destabilizing effects that's happening is actually petrifying authoritarian regimes in the region, whose populations are outraged over what they're seeing in Gaza, and they're also outraged at their own regimes for not doing anything to stop the genocide. And now that Trump has made this proposition of expelling the population of Gaza to maybe Egypt, maybe Syria, or maybe Jordan or somewhere else, these regimes are now in full panic. What are they going to do? They're caught between the wrath of their own citizens, who are outraged over what's happening in Gaza, but also outraged over the type of political, social, economic conditions that exist in their own society. And then these authoritarian regimes are caught on the other end between their alliance with the United States and Israel. What to do? You don't want to, you're caught between a rock and a hard place. I think one of the things that we're going to see from the genocide in Gaza is we're going to see an increase in radical extremism and militancy coming out of the Arab world and the broader Islam. Because, people are watching this horror show, and they're seeing the double standards, and they're seeing Western countries, apologize, support, back, and now in the case of the United States, openly advocate for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza. Young kids are watching this. They're watching the same politicians who sort of talk about high principle and international law and oppose annexation, occupation, and support war crimes prosecutions in Ukraine. The exact same people who say that in the West, in the context of Gaza, say the opposite. We don't recognize what the International Criminal Court is saying. We're not going to we're not going to arrest Netanyahu if he comes to the United States. The image, if you want to think one, I think, important image that's going to create radicalization is that we had this image in July of last year. We're in the middle of a genocide. Netanyahu comes to Washington, D.C. He gives a talk in front of a joint session of Congress. It's broadcast to the whole world. And Netanyahu gets 61 standing ovations. And I know it's 61 because I got my research assistant to do the counting. And then he came back earlier this last month and he was received as head of state, where Trump announced his plan. That type of sort of imagery produces radicalism. It's humiliating for people to see this type of dehumanization of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim life. And if you know anything about bin Laden is on record as saying that he got the idea for 9/11 when he was watching the Israeli bombing of Beirut in 1982, attacking those buildings. It radicalized him. Another theoretician of Islamist radical thinking is this Egyptian thinker by the name of Sayyid Qutb, who comes to the United States in 1949. And if you read his writings, one of the things that shocks him is he comes to the United States in 1949 and he can't understand why everyone in the United States is celebrating the birth of the state of Israel. Celebrations and sort of affirmations of such a wonderful thing. For him, he sees this as confirmation of the worst manifestations of American society. Because he saw what happened in 1948 as the destruction and the dispossession of the indigenous population of Palestine. And he comes to the United States and he sees the exact opposite, and he's trying to process it. And it contributes to his radicalization process. I predict that what is going to happen in Gaza, and Gaza is, I think, a global inflection point in terms of the world we live in terms of the politics of the region. It's going to produce, I think, predictably, we don't know when, the type of radical extremism that we've seen in other periods of time. And, we're just going to have to be prepared for that. And I think we're going to have to ask, well, who's responsible for this? Well, I think the people who are responsible for it are the people who are responsible for supporting this genocidal onslaught on Gaza. First and foremost, it's the leaders of Israel, and then it's their international backers. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I'm very depressed about the future of the Middle East. It's not a bright future. There's no reason to be optimistic that there's better things lying ahead. I think Gaza is going to further destabilize an already unstable region. And so just to come to a conclusion, I've already spoken to this idea of Western double standards of human rights actually makes the advocacy for human rights in Muslim societies much more difficult. Because what happens today is you go and you try and have these types of discussions in a Muslim majority context or in a mosque, and you say, look, human rights do matter, and human rights should be respected. Because human rights is viewed as a Western project, and because many of the self-proclaimed champions of human rights are the same people who are supporting a genocide in Gaza, young people view this and they go, that doesn't make sense. Where are the human rights for the Palestinians? Iqbal Ahmed, who was someone who influenced me deeply when I was growing up, sort of captured this broad problem and wrote that, he said, as Muslims, our first encounter with democracy was oppressive. Democracy came to us as oppressors, as colonizers, and as violators. As violators, they spoke the language of the Enlightenment, but engaged in the activities of barbarians. Secondly, after decolonization, our experience again with the democratic power centers, the United States, France, and Britain, was one that was deeply humiliating. Our experience, even in the second phase of our post-colonial history, was one of these big Western powers calling themselves the free world, but actively promoting neo-fascism and neo-fascist governments in one Muslim country and third world country after another. Historically, Iqbal Ahmed says the United States has spoken of democracy, it has openly backed dictators and despots. Therefore, he concludes that our first experience with democracy and human rights was outright repression, and our second experience with democracy and human rights was one in which the West promoted fascism and sometimes global fascism in several cases. So these double standards, as I said a moment ago, have consequences. They complicate the moral and ethical debates on human rights within Muslim societies. And this is sort of a big problem that has deep historical roots, because when Muslim intellectuals were trying to figure out what human rights means, that these human rights were coming from the West, they were sort of perplexed by whether the West was a model to emulate or a menace to reject. Because they saw these things about human rights that were being applied to their own citizens in Western countries, and that was attractive. But at the same time, these same Western powers were promoting oppression, supporting dictators, and in many ways authoritarian regimes in Muslim societies. So that's the type of confusion that often, complicates the debate. And then you have the American invasion of Iraq, you have Guantanamo Bay, you have, support for brutal dictators. All of this makes things much more difficult. And then you have the attendant problem of ongoing Western intervention in the region. One of the things that I think is unique about the Middle East in relationship to other parts of the developing world is that it has been subject to much greater levels of external intervention than other parts of the world, either directly or indirectly. Directly through the projection of power, or indirectly through the support of dictators and repressive regimes. Not just Israel, but other dictators in the region. And so this is, I think, something that complicates the moral context in which Muslims engage with the question of human rights. And so let me just end with a few points here. The idea, or the question that is often posed here is Islam compatible with human rights? Is actually the wrong question. And it's the wrong question because there's no such thing as a monolithic Islam. Just like there's no such thing as a monolithic Christianity, or a monolithic Judaism, or a monolithic Hinduism. There are individuals living in particular socioeconomic contexts, at particular moments in time, who are drawing upon their religious heritage to engage with these concepts. So the more important question, if you're interested in religion and human rights or religion and democracy, is to ask the question, under what social conditions can Islam and human rights be reconciled and promoted? One scholar of human rights has rightly noted, it is the political, social, and economic context that explains the status of human rights, for better or for worse. Islam is neither responsible for rights violations nor the core basis for advancing rights. This speaks to the question of context, political, economic, and social context. Religious interpretation, Quranic interpretation, undertaken in context where political freedom doesn't exist, where freedom of expression doesn't exist, where there's no social safety net, where there's no rule of law. Those types of interpretations of religion in authoritarian context are very different than interpretations of religion that take place in contexts where you do have basic economic rights and social political freedom. In other words, violent interpretations of Islam that we've witnessed over the last 50 years mirror, copy the state-sanctioned violence that Muslims have struggled against during the same period. Many of the most prominent Muslim advocates for revolution in the context of political Islam in the Arab Islamic world, from Sayyid Qutb, who I mentioned, to this figure of Ayman al-Zawahiri in Al-Qaeda, are products of the prison systems in their own countries, where they've been subjected to unspeakable cruelty. It's unsurprising then that people exposed to prolonged torture and extreme interrogation conclude that violence is a legitimate political tool. According to one prominent Palestinian Islamist, prison is my university, a point that was eloquently made hundreds of years ago by a Russian author and Marxist revolutionary thinker, Maxim Gorky, who wrote, "A people brought up in a school that reminds one of the torments of hell on a small scale, a people accustomed to the clenched fist, to prison and the whip, will not be blessed with a tender heart. The people that the police agents have ridden over will be capable in their turn of walking over the bodies of others. In a country where unrest has reigned so long, it's difficult for the people to realize from one day to the next the power of what constitutes human rights. One cannot demand from a man who has never known justice that he should be just." And this draws our attention to the structural conditions that I've been talking about in the Arab Islamic world that produce radical and violent interpretations of Islam. Changing these structural conditions, I think, will help advance the broad struggle for human rights in Muslim majority societies. And so let me just end on a somewhat positive note. I think one of the best sort of positive indications of human rights is making a difference in Muslim societies is the fact that not one, not two, not three, but 4 Muslim women in the last 2 decades have won the Nobel Peace Prize for their human rights. How many people can name those 4 women? How many people even know about them? Shireen Ebadi is one. Who? Malala. Malala Yousafzai is another.
Iranian woman recently won.
The recent Iranian woman won last year, Nargis Mohammadi. And then,
Nadia, was it from ISIS?
no, not her. Tawakkol Karman, the Yemenis, Arab human rights, civil rights activist who co-won it in 2014 for her work in Yemen in the context of human rights. These are the 4 women I'm talking about. These women championed human rights in their own society. Shireen Ebadi in 2003, Tawakkol Karman in 2011, Malala Yousafzai in 2014, and then Nargis Mohammadi more recently, and then of course there was a Muslim man, not a woman rights activist, Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. Shireen Ebadi was the first Muslim woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to secure human rights for women and children in Iran. Tawakkol Karman is the first Arab and Yemeni to receive human rights for her contributions during the Arab Spring. Malala Yousafzai is more well known as a child's rights activist who supports the rights of girls to get educated, who was targeted by the Taliban in an assassination attempt. She's the first ethnic Pashtun to be awarded the Nobel Prize and the second Pakistani to receive it. She identifies herself in her public engagements as both a feminist and a Muslim. And then Nargis Mohammadi is the heroic Iranian human rights activist who's currently in jail in Iran for human rights. These standard bearers for human rights illustrate a simple truism: that Muslim women's movements and activists are the locomotive for human rights advancement in many Muslim societies today, whether it be Muslim girls in Afghanistan, bravely resisting the Taliban denial of access to education, or the women's rights group in Malaysia called Sisters in Islam that advances women and minority rights in Malaysia. And finally, the heroic women and girls in Iran who have come out onto the streets at grave risk to fight for their own freedom in the context of the Women Life Freedom Movement. These are the, I think, standard bearers for human rights in Muslim societies today. I would also add that there's a lot of people who don't win the Nobel Prize and who don't have global recognition, but they're doing very important work at the local level in their own societies, often in very difficult conditions, to advance human rights. In many ways, those are the names and those are the figures who I think are the big heroes. So there's profound lessons for all of us to learn, for those who choose to heed them. And I'll stop there. Thanks. The floor is open. Yeah. Andy.
Oh, I was hoping they would end up on a positive note. So the idea of the Nobel Peace Prize being the gauge for what a positive note would be, I would take a little bit of exception to that, because many of these women are seen as sort of towing the line of Western hegemony and Western imperialism, and really they're just symbols that are being used by Western governments in order for them to advance their own particular imperialist agenda, especially given the won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I get your point on the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a mixed bag, right? Mandela won it as well. Martin Luther King won it as well. Henry Kissinger won it as well.
That's
The Japanese nuclear group won it. So it's a mixed bag. You're right. It's not, I think, an authentic representation, but sometimes they do get it right. In the case of, for example, Iran, I know specifically when the 2 women were awarded, this made a huge impact domestically, because when you win the Nobel Peace Prize, it makes it more difficult for a repressive regime to attack you. Malala Yousafzai, she's interested in child rights activists, but the one woman, Tawakkol Karman, she lives in the United States, and she's pretty courageous and critical of U.S. foreign policy on these issues. So yeah, I mean, look, it's not the best measure of sort of human rights, which is why I said that I think the real heroes, if you get a chance to live or travel to many of these societies, where in this case the Muslim majority population, you get a time to sort of spend time there, not just a tourist, but actually live there. You'll see that there's a lot of things happening below the radar screen that we're not aware of. But there's people, men, women, activists, labor unions, different, working in very difficult contexts, right? Getting arrested, going to jail, suffering often torture, and they come out and they don't have the recognition that I think they deserve. Those are the real heroes. I couldn't live in those conditions. I would probably flee. But I think if you look at that type of sort of grassroots engagement, if you take any country you want, you can find these people. I think those are the real heroes, which is why I said, while we understand the Nobel Peace Prize, it's actually interesting in the United States, the Nobel Peace Prize really isn't a big deal in this country. It's a big deal in Europe, it's a big deal in Canada, it's a big deal in countries that actually win it. In the United States, a lot of my students, when I asked them this question, I was actually impressed by this audience. Everyone here actually knew almost everyone. Most of my students, they don't have a clue about who these people are. So I get your point. Yeah, I mean, Nobel Peace Prize is, it's a mixed bag. When someone good wins it, I celebrate. And when someone doesn't, it's like, whatever. Yeah. But I think these prizes are really important. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was actually looking for some hope too, and I appreciate the more women that are doing this work. But I'm wondering if you could identify a majority Muslim state that is making significant advances in human rights.
Well, look, I think Tunisia was doing a pretty good job for 10 years after the Arab Spring. That's where the Arab Spring began.
Right.
They toppled the dictator. They had a really inclusive democratic constitutional process. Secularists, religious activists, people in between, women, minority groups were all part of it. They wrote a wonderful constitution. It was moving forward. The problem with Tunisia is now it's an authoritarian regime again. And the story of what happened in Tunisia, despite 10 years of progress, where you had a lot of advancement in terms of human rights protection, a lot of free and fair elections, the problem in Tunisia and why that experiment ended, and there's a big lesson here, it's a story of economic failure and collapse. You can't sustain a democratic project that takes human rights seriously when people are starving. And that's actually why the things changed, because you had a populist leader who came and said, look, we don't need all these political parties. We don't need all these 50 newspapers. All of these politicians are all corrupt. Give me the power and I will solve our economic problems. And so he comes to power, he stages a coup, he arrests all his opponents, he ends the constitution, and now he's running the country as a dictator. And if you think about that story, it's not that different from what we're sort of experiencing here in the United States. You have a lot of economic despair. People are getting less economically secure. Someone comes from outside of the system and says, give me the power. I will sort of deal with all of these corrupt ruling elites, and I will sort of, I will make your life better. In fact, that's actually, there's a reference in the history of political theory where Aristotle writes in his book, The Politics, that the problem with democracy, he was skeptical of democracy, he said the problem with democracy at his time is that democracy in ancient Greece meant rule of the masses. The masses were poor. Aristotle said the problem with democracy, the rule of the poor, was that it was always susceptible to producing tyranny. Because someone would come along eventually and say, look, give me the power, appoint me as your leader, I will solve your political problems. and he says in the context of that discussion, the more stable political system in any political arrangement is one where you have a sizable middle class that can act as a stabilizing force between the poles of society. And when that starts to go away, and you have lots of poor people desperate, make ends meet, a tyrant, or the rise of a tyrant is inevitable, who emerges. And so that's exactly what happened in Tunisia. The other answer to your question is if you look at the periphery of the Islamic world, in countries like Indonesia, you have much better levels of democracy. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim majority society. Since the toppling of the pro-American dictator in 1998, you have had a much better transition and stability. A lot of internal problems as well, of human rights violations, but much better prospects. In the case of the Arab world, unfortunately, you have a lot of dictators, a lot of despots, many of them backed by the West, simply because they want those dictators in place to do the bidding of the West, economically, with respect to Israel, and so you have very poor prospects for human rights. But if the other danger here is when we talk about religion and human rights is someone will get this idea and well, where are the examples of Muslim majority societies of human rights? Maybe there is something in this religion that produces authoritarianism in human rights. I can now more easily make that argument in the context of the West. What is it about Christianity or Western society that produced Donald Trump? Where did he come from?
Well, maybe we could say, what is it about religion?
Yeah, or you can say about religion.
That it's not Islam or Christianity. What is it about religion?
Yeah, exactly.
That
But then,
produces, that leads to this
type of behavior. Then you get into the problem is how do you explain all of these horrific cases of extreme authoritarianism that was justified in the name of some sort of secular religious project? Communist China, North Korea today, Stalin. I mean, I would even say Nazism, right? So the way I would deal with that is the question is not religion or non-religion. The question is what interpretations of religion can we identify that are human rights enhancing, that are democracy enhancing. So in the case of the United States, the whole struggle for civil rights in this country is inseparable from the role of the Black church and the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., for example, right? That was a major source of organizing and mobilization. There's this very famous image that you might be familiar with during the height of the civil rights movement in this country, where there was a protest led by Martin Luther King over this bridge called the Edmunds Pettus Bridge, where there was a march that was taking place. I think it was in Selma, Alabama, and he's leading the march, and he's fighting for equal rights, civil rights. On the other side of the bridges, you have the established state authorities with their state troopers waiting to confront them. If you take a look back and you look at actually what's happening from the perspective of religion, you actually have two constituencies of groups of people who were very religious. The Alabama state troopers were trying to support and continue segregation, and they were deeply religious. In fact, they were deeply religious in a Protestant sort of Christian way. Martin Luther King Jr. and his supporters were also deeply religious. Both of them using the same Bible, both of them drawing upon the same religious heritage, both of them interpreting the moral example of Jesus Christ, but coming up with very different ethical and political projects of what that religious heritage meant for the United States in the 1960s. So I would argue that there are a lot of examples of religion playing particularly important and supportive roles in advancing social justice. The other case that's obvious that you'd be familiar with is the case of Mahatma Gandhi. There are these movements known as liberation theology in Latin America, where people who are deeply Christian. The problem where religion and politics comes in is when we talk about political power. And when religious forces want to access political power without any checks or balances and any sort of veto over their access to the political system. That's when you get into the problem of corruption and exploitation. That can also apply on the other side as well. The problem, I think, fundamentally, that history teaches us is that when you have people in power, whether religious or secular or somewhere in between, who are not accountable, who are not in favor of transparency, who aren't in favor of any sort of regular checks and balances on their control, then you have the problem of corruption, authoritarianism, and nepotism. I would argue that's what's happening right here in our society right now. There is no checks and balances. I mean, theoretically they are, but the problem is that you have ruling elites and you have an electoral system that effectively can be purchased if you have enough money, and there's no way of changing that unless we rewrite the electoral rules, which is why one of the things that Bernie Sanders said that really appealed to me in 2016 is that one of the challenges facing the United States is we need new campaign finance laws. Because without that, you can basically buy elections, as we're seeing. So the other thing about religion is that there's a lot of examples of religion playing important roles as community organizing events, mobilizing, bringing people together. But it can go wrong, just like any sort of, I think, project, ideological project can go wrong without proper leadership, without proper guidance. So the problem is, what you just said is very familiar to a lot of people because part of our understanding of modernity, of progress, is that religion is just sort of a force that will less of it the better, right? This is the example of the French Revolution. Religion was connected to the old regime, religion is a source of backwardness, religion is sort of, the other thing about religion is that, whatever you think about religion, you might wish it away, but it doesn't look like, at least in the Muslim world, it's going to go away anytime soon. It's just a reality, it's a fact of life. So if you're serious about social political change, taking a strong anti-religious perspective, like you see from some of these new atheists, people who are hyper-secular, it's not going to get you anywhere. It might make you feel good in your circle of friends, because you can sort of pontificate about how noble and righteous you are, but you're not going to be able to engage with people at the grassroots. So I think one of the most important things that people should do is you have to be religiously literate in the society that you're living in. And so for Muslim activists who are interested in human rights, democracy, and sort of activism, I say you've got to know your Quran better than your adversaries. Because they're going to start quoting scripture to you, and they're going to, get mass following because they can do that. And unless you can push back on that level, you're going to be at a disadvantage. That also applies to certain sections here in the United States. We have very Christian communities, and people are sort of, we're seeing this right now. If you listen to some of the crazy things that J.D. Vance is saying. He's saying that the policies of Trump are very much in keeping with the example of Jesus Christ. We worry about ourselves, we shouldn't sort of, all of these things that he's sort of saying is justified in a particular, I would argue, corrupt understanding of Christianity. And so if you're going to go to a community and try and sort of push back against that, you've got to know the language, the colloquial language, the language that resonates, and how you can sort of pull the carpet out from underneath that of your adversary by knowing that you have a much better grasp of your own religious vocabulary than your adversaries do. Because unless you don't, you're going to lose those political battles and debates. So those are my views on the whole question of religion.
I'm sorry, we have time for probably one more question, then we got to wrap it up. You get the last question. All right.
So again, thank you very much for this. I think understudied maybe or underappreciated topic in the West or in the United States. You talk about like some of the imagery of Islam in Western media. You mentioned Saeed and others. I wonder, as someone who's lived in Turkey, I wonder if you could speak to Turkey a little bit and what Erdogan. So Erdogan claims to speak for the Islamic community, right? Or he wants to be like the new Sultan or the new Caliph, if you will, of the Middle East. So he sees himself as the leader of the region's Muslims and speaks on behalf of Palestinian rights. But at the same token, when it comes to Kurdish issues, however, we see a ceasefire yesterday, so we'll see what happens. But again, internal issues you might not be willing to speak out about. But I wonder if you could talk about where do you see Turkey human rights or Turkey in this model juggling between or balancing between Islam and the West, which is that tightrope walk that like any Turkish leader has to kind of do. And I think Erdogan has done it very deftly for many years.
See, the problem with Erdogan is that he's a politician. And I think you're always going to get into trouble if you put your hopes in a politician. Because a politician's in political power, perpetuating it. He's not really an ethical, moral guy. That's the driving force. I think Erdogan's first 10 years of rule were actually something to admire. Because he comes out of obscurity, becomes the mayor of Istanbul, challenges the entrenched military, authoritarian, republican, secular control over Turkey, and does open up the political space. From 2002 to 2012, Turkey was, I think, moving in a much better direction on the Kurdish issue, on internal human rights issues, even on the question of the Armenian genocide. There's actually significant, I was there at the time, and you were having these debates that no one thought could ever happen. But then, like any political leader, he's worried about getting reelected, and then he starts to crack down. He starts to sort of repress, he starts to close political space. And so now you have a situation where Turkey is, very different than it was during the first decade. He aspires to be a great political leader. He says a lot of nice things on Palestine. If you follow closely, Turkey's trade relationship with Israel, notwithstanding the genocide, is still ongoing. And so, of course, everyone gets along very well with Donald Trump. And for reasons that are not to be not difficult to figure out, authoritarian strongmen. So, that's what I think about Turkey. I think Turkey does at least have things going for it that other countries in the Middle East don't. At least you have regular elections that are basically free and fair. There's manipulation, but there's the institutional sort of that matter for Turkey are there in place. You don't have free and fair elections in many different countries. So in that sense, there's hope that things can change. That produces accountability. The press is a mess in Turkey. At one time, Erdogan had the reputation of being the biggest jailer of journalists in the world, mostly because of the Kurdish issue. Because they have this law called terrorism, and anyone who's considered to be supportive of Turkish rights is inherently a terrorist, which is very similar to the discourse in Israel, right? You support Palestinian rights, you're inherently a terrorist. So that's what I think about Turkey. So thank you for coming, and
Thank you. Next Sunday, we'll talk about AI. Oh, yeah.